Welcome back to The Left Field, the podcast where four friends discuss their fantasy Congress League and what the Democrats are up to from a leftist perspective. We're your hosts. I'm Himanshu Pandey.
I'm Alexi Jenkins.
I'm Luis Pagan.
And I'm Chandan.
This week, I'm profiling Lauren Underwood for Representative Yay or Nay. So Rep Yay or Nay is where we do a deep dive into a Democratic member of the House or the Senate. We look into their background, prominent legislation, and where they stand on key progressive issues. Then we give them either a yay or a nay based on whether or not they're truly out here fighting for the people. So Lauren Underwood is a House member from Illinois. She represents the 14th House District. And for those of us who are not familiar with that district, it is an area outside of Chicago. So it basically forms a rim from northern Chicago down to the west side. It's not actually the city. It's half of a half moon. And it includes the suburbs of Crystal Lake, Geneva, Oswego. I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly. Woodstock, and Yorksville. So it's a mostly white conservative district. And this is really important because this district is a very stark example of gerrymandering. It was created after the 2010 census. So its characteristic as mostly white and conservative comes from the fact that a big chunk of it is part of McHenry County, which is the only county in the district that went for Trump during the 2020 election. So that county went for Trump by about 2.5 percentage points. And then the other areas that the district cuts through, they all went for Joe Biden by about 7 percentage points. And those are, I think there are about 4 counties total that are included in the district. So it's really, really sliced up to get that Republican advantage. So the district was represented by a white conservative Republican before Lauren Underwood won her seat. And that was in 2018. But before we get to that part, I want to back up a little bit to talk about her background. So she was born on October 4th, 1986 in Ohio. So now she's 34 years old. She's a millennial. She grew up in Naperville, Illinois, and I actually have family that lives there. So, hey, she was a Girl Scout for a long time. And then from 2003 to 2004, she worked for the city of Naperville's Fair Housing Advisory Committee. Then she went to college. She got a bachelor's degree in nursing from the University of Michigan. And then she got 2 master's degrees from Johns Hopkins University. So she has a master's of science in nursing and a master of public health. Then she went on and became a registered nurse. And 5 years after getting her master's, she began her career in politics. So in 2014, she became a member of the Obama administration as a senior advisor to the Department of Health and Human Services. And while she was in that role, she worked to implement the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as the ACA, also known as Obamacare, if you are Fox News. In 2017, after that role, she was a director at an insurance company. This is a little bit of a mixed bag. So the insurance company was called Next Level Health. It was an insurance company that managed a Medicaid plan, so for low-income people, and it was Black owned. Nevertheless, it was still an insurance company, which I think informs some of her later stances that we'll get into in a bit. So that company actually closed near the beginning of the pandemic in July 2020. At this time, she was also an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University School of Nursing and Health. Going back to her career as a congresswoman, she was elected in 2018, and she defeated the Republican incumbent by about a 2.5% margin. She said at the time that she decided to run for the seat because then Representative Randy Holtgren voted to repeal the ACA, and she actually has a heart condition. So that's considered a pre-existing condition. And without the ACA, it'd be much harder for her to get healthcare. Obviously, before she was a congresswoman, because now she has the Cadillac of health plans. But at the time, that was a concern. So when she was elected, she was the youngest Black woman to serve in Congress. She was, I believe, 31 at the time. And she was reelected in 2020 by a 1.34% margin. So about half her margin the first time around. That sounds like a really small margin, but it was actually the 9th closest race for the House during the 2020 election cycle. And it took 9 days for the Associated Press to call the race. She was in one of those very, very vulnerable House districts, which I think really makes the picture of her tenure and where the country is politically extremely interesting, as we'll get into a little more as we get into her policies. This is where things get really interesting. So So far, Lauren Underwood sounds really good. She's a young Black millennial. She's had, besides working for an insurance company, a pretty good backstory. And then she gets elected to Congress. One of the first times I ever heard about her was in a Vox article that was talking about all of the Democrats who were elected during the blue wave of 2018 who were not progressive. And the headline was very explicitly pitting them versus AOC. It was like the New Democrats versus AOC.
Oh boy.
People interviewed in it were like Abigail Spanberger, Katie Hill, and Lauren Underwood. So she's been kind of positioned as this young Democrat future of the party who is an alternative to some of the progressive stars. Her main topics are health, which makes sense given her nursing background, and armed forces and national security. She's collaborated with Republicans many times on anti-terrorism bills. If you look down her list of sponsored and co-sponsored legislation, a lot of them are counterterrorism bills that have all Republicans except for like her signed on. During her first term, she touted on her website that she co-sponsored 4 bills that Trump signed into law.
That's awful.
Yeah, it was highlighted by her campaign in 2020 as a reason to show that she gets stuff done and she's a bipartisan legislator. They were things like national security and veterans care. She does a lot of veterans bills as well. So one was the Veterans Care Quality Transparency Act that became law, and it required reporting of all agreements entered into by the Department of Veteran Affairs with private entities about suicide prevention and mental health services. So that's her recent legislation from her previous term. Her most important piece of legislation that she's introduced so far, it's the Protecting Moms and Babies Against Climate Change Act, and she actually co-wrote this with Ed Markey. So what this bill would do is direct the Department of Health and Human Services to identify what they're calling climate risk zones for pregnant people and then invest in mitigation members there. It would also require funding to train healthcare workers to identify climate change risks to pregnant women. This bill specifically addresses the issue of Black maternal mortality, which is great because the disparities between Black and white women giving birth are huge and really horrible when it comes to the death rates. So that's one of her pet issues. She actually founded the Black Maternal Health Caucus, and she's now on the Committee on Education and Labor, the Committee on Veterans Affairs, as well as the Congressional Black Caucus, the LGBT Equality Caucus, and like I mentioned before, the Black Maternal Health Caucus. She's vice chair of the Committee on Homeland Security and the chair of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation. Her committee positions, for the most part, really reflect her 2 priorities of healthcare and counterterrorism. According to 538, as of June 2021, Underwood has voted with Joe Biden's stated positions 100% of the time. She's also, compared to some other legislators, pretty good at showing up for her job. So according to ProPublica, she only missed 0.5% of votes, and she's only voted against her party 1.1% of the time. So her policies, this is where it gets even ickier. The more you wade into the details with Lauren Underwood, the more complicated and unfortunate the picture gets. On Medicare for All, she is against it for the time being for quote unquote practical purposes. She's in favor of the ACA, which makes sense because she literally implemented it. And she's also worked for an insurance company. So it makes sense that she's not out here trying to abolish insurance companies. She said that healthcare is a human right and that Medicare for All is a great goal, but that we should wait until we have good answers about what it would cost. This is ironic and strategic because her Republican opponent in 2020 actually ran attack ads against her saying that she supported a single payer plan. There's a lot of, when you Google her and any of these issues, a lot of right-wing nonsense propaganda about how far left she is that is not at all borne out by any of her actual positions. The Green New Deal, it gets even worse. She has not come out in support of the Green New Deal, and she's actually made a couple of dismissive comments about the policy. So when she was asked about it at the very beginning of her first term, she shrugged and said, "I don't know much about it. I've just seen the hashtags," which for an incoming congressperson in 2018 is pretty unforgivable because her job is to know these things. So in 2019, she doubled down and she said, "What exactly is the Green New Deal and what exactly are they going to do?" Once again, a little disingenuous because the Green New Deal is a very short policy paper that you can read and it'll tell you exactly what they're trying to do. It's very accessible to the public. However, on her website, she says she supports, quote, a comprehensive approach to energy policy that expands investment and deployment of renewable energy products and public transportation, unquote. Her bill with Markey is also indicative of the fact that she does kind of support the things the Green New Deal stands for. Her work on Black maternal mortality and its connection to the environment is a clear example of racial justice, even if she's not calling it that. So on reparations, she hasn't said anything about it. I think it is worth mentioning again her work on the issue of Black maternal mortality, because that is a racial justice issue quite clearly. Indigenous rights and land back, nothing's out there on that. LGBTQ plus rights, a little bit of a clear picture. She was endorsed by the Human Rights Campaign and she did support the Equality Act. I had a qualm with the way that her press release on her website reported that. She said that she supported its quote unquote bipartisan passage in the House. Technically, that's right, but there were 8 Republicans who voted in favor of the Equality Act and 173 who voted against it. So calling it bipartisan is a little dramatic. Women's rights is a similar boat, as you can kind of guess, based on her focus on pregnancy and pregnancy health and her background as a nurse. She's pretty good on this issue. She got 100% score from NARAL, Pro-Choice America, and from Planned Parenthood. And in 2020, she voted to condemn forced sterilizations, and she voted in favor of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act that, clearly did not pass in 2020. When it comes to police reform and defunding, she has been oddly quiet on this issue, given the fact that it's number one, a huge issue in the country. Number 2, she's Black. Number 3, she's from Chicago. You would expect her to have a vocal position about this. There really wasn't much out there. She expressed positive sentiments about the peaceful element of the protests that happened in 2020 and then condemned any violence. She did support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which we've talked about before on this podcast, and how it actually increased funding to the police and is not an example of defund. But on her website, she listed this as a gun violence issue, which I thought was weird. She has no section on policing, and she had all of her press releases about policing under the issue of gun violence. Drug reform and decriminalization, also no stance on that. Immigration, this is probably the worst one. In 2018, you saw it coming with her fixation on counterterrorism. In 2018, she sponsored, not even co-sponsored, sponsored a bill to authorize the U.S. Customs and Border Protection to conduct, quote unquote, counterterrorism network activities in order to, quote, enhance border security, unquote. And I looked at the text of this bill. Basically, what it would do would make it harder for people to enter the US if they were a member of an organization on the Secretary of State's terrorist list. That sounds good at first. You think this is probably ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are on there. But as I learned from working with asylum applicants, this list has more to do with the US's foreign policy priorities than it does with actual terrorism. For example, basically any organization affiliated with Palestine is designated a terrorist organization. So the Palestinian Liberation Front, which is a Palestinian political party, is on the list and would be included in that bill. So that's Lauren on the issues. In terms of scandals, she's pretty scandal-free. She's also pretty fresh in the House, so she hasn't had a ton of time to develop those scandals.
It sounds like she's representing the burbs.
On principle, I'm going to say no. Considering the makeup of the district, it is nice that someone from that area is working with Ed Markey on a climate change bill. That's nice.
Yes, but I think it's worth noting she was one of the most vulnerable people in her last race after her first term. And if she had a more real legislative track record, that number wouldn't have dropped as much,
Yeah.
It's a nay for me. I'm not expecting her to do any groundbreaking legislation, and I fully expect her to vote with Biden. But also, can you vote against Biden right now as a Democrat? If it's going to pass, then it means you're voting with Biden. It's interesting that her most progressive legislation is the least political, I guess, the least outwardly political.
Totally. She's definitely trying to play it safe while not realizing that that's the worst strategy.
Veterans and moms. Who can quibble with veterans and moms?
Also, so much danger of immigration to the burbs of Chicago. That's really where all the immigrants are going.
Yeah, I'm going to nay her. I think clearly it goes without saying that she's better than the Republican that she beat out in 2018 and 2020. Obviously, she's better than them, but I just want to analyze these representatives with more nuance than just, are they Republican? Yes or no? Okay, checker X. Like for me, she doesn't cut it. I think she seems good on paper, but once you start digging into her policy stances, there's not a lot there to celebrate, especially with her hyper dismissive attitude of the Green New Deal and Medicare for all.
If someone who's blue can win in that district, I would prefer someone who wasn't actively dismissive of progressive policy.
It's such an example of like, this district shouldn't exist in this shape. This should not be the seat that is considered conservative and white. It should be a seat that reflects Chicago and reflects more accurately the population instead of cramming all of those votes in together. It's just an example of what we lose when we redistrict and when we let HR 1 die in the Senate, which is happening.
So today I'm going to be covering a bill called the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act 2021. Despite it sounding boring, according to one of our panelists here.
I basically fell asleep reading the name of the bill, so I'm prepared to be enlightened.
So it's sponsored by Tammy Duckworth. It was originally introduced on March 23rd, 2021. One of the first things that the bill does is amends the existing voluntary school and childcare led testing grant to include public water systems, eligible nonprofit organizations that service schools and childcare locations to also get those grants. So essentially, before, they were only providing money to schools and childcare centers to do the lead testing. But now they're like, oh, well, sometimes we have like the actual utilities who provide them the water. If it's corroded at the school level, what if it's actually not corroded at the school level, it's just corroded more upstream? They're allocating $120 million over the next 5 years. They also are going to be allocating $10 million a year until 2026 for the EPA to examine the state of existing and emerging technology to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities, to essentially to the treatment monitoring of public water systems, which is important considering just the hacks that have happened recently. Also, Biden gave Putin like a list of critical infrastructure, which was super weird to not hack. And my guess is that water is within that infrastructure.
Wait, what? He said, hey, Putin, hostile foreign leader, here's a list of all of our most important pieces of infrastructure.
Yeah, he did. He literally did that.
Did that come with a threat?
No, not really. Just straight up just shopping list for Putin.
I mean, Putin's MO is doing things that are illegal nationally and internationally, and then saying that he wasn't involved in it. That's how he's gotten away with killing political dissidents for decades.
So the bill also provides $50 million a year until 2026 to have their water systems increase resilience to national hazards, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and extreme weather events. So essentially, this would promote water conservation, enhance water efficiency, create desalination facilities, which is super important, relocate or renovate existing vulnerable water systems, and then just implement measures to increase resiliency to national hazards, extreme weather events, including events that are the result of climate change. In addition to that, there's another $20 million a year until 2026 for the EPA to assist in 15 projects for waste to energy systems, sludge collection systems, anaerobic digesters, methane capture and transfer, and other emerging technologies that transform waste into energy, which can be a form of renewable energy. It also provides another $25 million a year until 2026 to address the rising threats to clean water infrastructure from climate change specifically. This is for grants for planning, design, construction, implementation, operation to essentially like weatherize our water treatment in like wastewater infrastructure. On April 29th, 2021, the bill passed the US Senate 89-2. And the only two no votes were Republicans, Ted Cruz from Texas and Mike Lee from Utah. One of the interesting things about the bill is that it doesn't mention the words climate change even one time, but instead in the bill it used the phrasing increasing resilience to natural hazards and extreme weather events, which I thought was interesting, considering that there's a lot of climate change related aspects into the bill, and it could have been a strategy. So it's passed the Senate, it's now over to the House, and it's more than likely going to pass.
Say climate change 3 times while looking into a mirror, it comes out and hurricanes you.
Same with defund the police, but for defund, you only have to say it one time. And then a neoliberal will come out and tell you how that's bad phrasing.
Yep. That's the bill. Was that super boring?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was really boring. And I'm going to make a case for the fact that that's a good thing. The actual business of governance is boring and it's technical and it's stuff like this that does a lot of things, all of which are boring and technical that need to happen. I think that's a good thing.
One of the things that I thought was the most important from this was funding being given to desalination systems. I think desalination is going to be one of the most important ways for us to weather climate change generally, because rising sea levels are going to compromise some of our freshwater systems in our lakes. And just generally, water is going to become the new oil. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this multiple times. There's already been a lot of different geopolitical conflicts and just general breaking down of societies because of water issues. The sooner that we can protect those systems, the better, because that is absolutely critical infrastructure. The language in here in terms of using renewable energy sources to power a lot of those systems, I think is also very important. There's a lot of things here in terms of water reuse, which I thought was really valuable. There's a lot of important things that we can do with gray water systems to essentially just reuse the water.
It's also good to see the fact that they're trying to extract all of the value from our waste. I mean, that's the point of the aerobic digesters. That's the point of capturing methane and creating a sustainable energy system based on our waste, as opposed to just burying it in the ground and hoping for the best.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I've actually never heard of that concept, and I find that really fascinating.
Sure. I mean, it's a major concept in circular economy. The whole point is to utilize all of the energy that goes into a system. So when you grow crops and you create food for people, the majority of the time you're only using about 50 to 70% of the crop if you're lucky, right? There's a bunch of waste that's left over. And a lot of times people will try and reappropriate that for different things. Sometimes it gets fed to cattle, sometimes it's used as fertilizer, but a lot of times it just ends up being waste. Same with our poop and just a bunch of other general human waste. As opposed to just burying it into the ground, which landfills can be used to capture some degree of energy. But as opposed to just doing it that way in a passive system collecting energy, you can create an active system where you use bacteria to break down goods and create an energy dense fuel source like methane. Now you have a fuel source. Now you can use that energy for something as opposed to just releasing it into the environment or cleanly burning it. You can cleanly burn it, quote unquote, in this case, to use that energy for something. In this case, it seems like they're trying to use it for desal, which is great because desalination takes tons of energy. That's just one way to maximize the usage of our everyday products.
So what I'm hearing is poop power plants.
100%. Everybody poops.
Human waste is basically a renewable resource. We're all eating, we're all pooping. And it's, pretty consistent.
I would say it naturally is an energy source, right? I mean, think about forests. How forests get fertilized by the creatures that are excreting and by the fungi and other resources that are decomposing that and reusing that energy. If we don't do that and we just create waste that never gets used, we're introducing a bunch of waste into our system, and that doesn't have all of the energy utilized, which is in stark contrast to what nature does, which is it reutilizes as much energy as possible to keep itself going.
It's basically like in the human body when the kidneys stop working and you can't dispose of waste. That's literally our system. And then we're wondering why our society is dying because we're filling it up with waste. It makes a lot of sense.
That's exactly right.
There's 15 different projects. It'll be essentially $100 million total for research into these waste to energy systems. It's absolutely an energy source that we should be taking advantage of. It's interesting the tactics that Tammy has used to get almost universal support for the bill for climate change. It's not that coded. There's things that she did in this bill that could be valuable for Democrats in the Senate to kind of borrow from in order to just get stuff passed.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct that was a political choice to pass a climate change bill without it being framed as a climate change bill. I'm kind of two minds about this. So in this case, it doesn't bother me because it seems like her legislation actually follows through with a lot of the promises that the movement to make our society more sustainable is committed to. It seems like she isn't shirking away from those things. She just packaged it in a way that works for the current political moment. On the flip side of that, when a lot of these Democrats that we talk about shy away from terms like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and defund the police, the sense that I get is that they are quibbling with the language, but it's also more deeply rooted in that, and that they don't actually agree with the underlying ideals. In those situations, when we're evaluating representatives, I find those terms very important because if you're not willing to go as far as saying, I support Medicare for all, then you probably don't support single payer. I mean, some of the people we've talked about have been that case where they actually do support it, but how far does that go with the details if you're not willing to come out and say, this is what I support? There's going to be a point where that support dries up. I feel like it can be tactically used to great outcomes, like in this case, but it is something that I definitely have my antennas up about when it comes to people being very pedantic about the language.
I agree with you. One of the things I will say, though, is if you go onto Tammy's website and, when she talks about this bill passing, climate change is all over.
Yeah, that's another reason that I feel like this is different, because she actually does care about climate change. It shows more good faith.
And I didn't really expect this from Tammy Duckworth, to be honest. I've considered her to not necessarily be 100% within the progressive camp, but it's got renewable energy and issues in terms of light contamination that are more systemic. Cybersecurity, they're just good. They're needed. When we're talking about our water systems, it is boring. Yeah, but this shit is critical. It's probably one of those bills, I'm sure even the Republicans are like, yeah, we can't really fuck with this.
When bills pass with this overwhelming bipartisan support at where we are politically right now, it immediately makes me think this must be such a half measure of a half measure. It's definitely going in the right direction, but it makes me think this isn't going to make a big dent in the problem if the Republicans aren't throwing a fit about it, because they'll throw a fit about anything that gets even close to any sort of systemic change. So that's always something that I do look for as well as a point of concern, just in terms of scale, not substance.
And we'll see what the follow through is, right? It's one of those things where you can put it in there, but is the actual regulation teeth going to be there? We'll see.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Left Field. If you're looking for more leftist takedowns of the current order or to find out what's left of America, you can find us wherever you get podcasts. Send any comments or suggestions to leftfieldpoliticspod@gmail.com and find us on Instagram at leftfieldpolitics. Until next time, Left Fielders.